right. All right.
Greetings.
Are we ready? Ready to go? Is everyone their microphones ready? Cameras ready?
We're all
Ready?
good. I think we're good. I think we're live.
Hi, good
Okay.
afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
From
Afternoon.
from
Good
a cold
afternoon.
Cape Town.
All right, let's start. Mankind is challenged as it has never been before to prove its maturity and mastery, not of nature, but of itself. South Africa currently sits in a mesh of socioeconomic difficulties ranging from high levels of inequality, food insecurity, unequal access to education, and more, all which contribute to the disempowerment of our people in our neoliberal world. We begin our session today with some excellent, highly esteemed panelists who will provide us with some dimension and depth on today's topic, redefining racism. So, an official welcome to each of our panelists. If you can just say hi to all the viewers, I'm sure they're excited to see your faces and to engage with you today.
Hi,
How's it
Russell.
going?
So before we begin today's session, I'm going to just give each of you a small bio of who the speakers or the panelists are for today, what they've done, and how you can engage them. So I'll start with Mr. Carter. His name is Karl Carter. He is the CEO of Snake Nation, which is a disruptive media and monetization company for creative rebels in film, music, art, fashion, dance, and tech. It's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Cape Town, and they're currently building a platform to help the M2, the multicultural millennials, build an audience, distribute their products, monetize their work in our global creative economy. He is also a father, an entrepreneur, a creative rebel, and innovator. Welcome to today's session, Karl. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great. Coming to you live from Atlanta. Hope everyone is well. Missing Cape Town. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here and in the thick of everything going on in the country. So thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Our next panelist for today is Dr. Russell Ali. He is an appointed executive director of the Development and Alumni Department at UCT from the 1st of August 2013. He worked for previous 5 years at Ford Foundation, a nonprofit grant-making foundation based in New York. Before joining the Ford Foundation, Ali was the country representative and executive director of the Charles Stewart Maud Foundation in South Africa and worked for the United Nations Office and High Commissioner for Human Rights. He also served on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Human Rights Violation Committee, which is chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Welcome, Dr. Russell Ali, to today's session. How are you feeling?
Thanks, and please just call me Russell. I'm actually sad today. You mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I just received the news today that one of our former colleagues was on the Truth Commission. Some people may know him, Tom Mantata. He passed away, and it was COVID related.
Oh man!
Oh, geez, my condolences, Russell.
Condolences to anybody who knew Tom. A very, very gentle and highly principled person who will be sadly missed. It's a real loss. So I'm feeling very sad, but I'm also quite sort of excited because these were kinds of issues that we discussed, as you well can imagine, during the time that Tom and I were together at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and later at the Human Rights Commission. So I feel it's a little bit of a tribute to Tom. That's how I want to see my participation here this afternoon.
Absolutely, and where Tom is, he is smiling above because he is happy with the contribution that you're making on his behalf and on behalf of yourself as well. Our final panelist for today is a lady by the name of Moky Mokura. She was born in Nigeria, educated in England, and has lived in London, Johannesburg, and Lagos. She is the executive director of Africa No Filter, a donor collaborative focused on shifting the African narrative. Prior to that, she was the Deputy Director for Communications Africa at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she was responsible for building and managing the foundation's reputation on the continent. Among a plethora of other things, we'd like to welcome Ms. Moky Mokura to today's session. Welcome, Moky. How are you feeling? And thank you for being here with us.
I'm feeling good, and I feel really churlish to have to do this, but it's Moky, not Mocky.
Okay,
Sorry,
Moky.
had to do that. So now we've
Okay.
cleared it. I'm feeling good, very excited by the conversation we're about to have. I think it's a very important one.
Absolutely.
All right. And just a big thank you again to this amazing initiative. It's a campus party digital edition, inviting creative minds and important minds to our central conversations. So I'd like to start today's question with...
Before you ask a question, I want you to tell us about you.
Yes.
Okay.
Who was this wonderful person who is going to be facilitating this discussion?
All right, so the facilitator and moderator of today's discussion is Nkanyezi Kakane. I'm originally from Johannesburg, West Rand. I'm currently staying in the Western Cape studying economics and finance at University of the Western Cape. 21 years old, I'm involved in media and entertainment. I am a DJ at Good Hope FM. I'm also a society representative at Snake Nation. I also have graduated from the Gordon Institute of Business Science from their Spirit of Youth program. I'm currently a youth volunteer at SIRE, which is the South African International Institute for young people and their affairs. I've been involved with SASTA, which is the National Research Foundation's Youth Edition for Science Communication. I am an innovator. I'm involved with my first company with myself and my partner, We Are Social, which is aimed at making sure that creators are represented in Cape Town and making sure that they are able to get the platform and monetize what they do. I'm also a speaker. I love words. I love music. I love dance. And I love to engage with people of different backgrounds and understand what their opinion is of things. So that is me.
You're not even 30 yet. Oh my goodness.
I know.
Not even a millennial. She's a Gen Z.
The world has to work out. Yeah, they have to work out. Yeah.
Absolutely. This is the representation that, our young South Africans need, because all of them are like me. All of them have something to say, all of them are disruptive. And that's exactly what the campus party is about, making sure that they have their voice loud and clear to amazing people like you.
Absolutely. No.
Okay, so if everyone is ready, yes, sorry, Karl?
No, I was just going to say, I can testify to the power of South Africa's youth, and some of the most inspiring and just motivated young people I've come across. So I think, across the board, I'm excited to see where the conversation goes today.
Right. So, today's session, the title, as I said previously, is Redefining Racism. And the opinion piece that was attached, to our initial introduction to this topic is an opinion piece written by Moky Mokura, where she speaks about the Black Lives Matter movement and South Africa's global engagement with that particular movement. Before we head into that amazingly written piece, the question that I'd like to ask is, do you believe that it's time that we redefined racism to include systemic racism? What I mean by this is that racism was initially characterized by biological differences between the different racial groups. But racism is an all-encompassing phenomenon that goes beyond the way I look and my physical abilities, according to how they were initially characterized by, within colonial times. So the question is, do you guys believe that it is time to redefine racism, and what unconventional definitions of racism that you have in this particular time? I think I'll start with Mr. Russell Ali. What do you think?
Oh, you put me on the spot. So I'm going to, at the risk of coming across as an ageist. So I hope the camera is sort of kind to me, but I'm 62 years old. Okay. And I think in those sort of 6 decades, as a person of color, Black person growing up in South Africa, which was the center, at least in the 20th century, was the sort of center of racism globally. I think if we go back a sort of century, it probably would have been the United States of America before the abolition of slavery. and before that, the sort of colonial legacy of Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And but the 6 decades that I've sort of been around, I've experienced this issue that has sort of been with us. It almost seems as if it's been around forever. It's a sort of perennial issue, you know, the color question. If you remember, even Du Bois in his opening and one of his works speaks about the color line as a defining question of our time. So I've seen how, from direct experience and also, I suppose, through an intellectual inquiry, the way in which our understanding of race and racism and our responses, how they've evolved and changed. And so and what's interesting, I think, is that in all the sort of iterations or the evolution, it's very often been young people who've been at the forefront. So if I think about my own personal sort of journey, my first introduction or exposure to politics was through the Black Consciousness movement.
Mm.
And if you remember, that was the movement of Biko and Bani Tatiane and others. But they were influenced, of course, also by the Black Panthers in the USA, Stokely Carmichael and others. But they were young people. You know, I mean, Biko, as you know, was murdered in his 30s.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the modern resurgence or the current resurgence of how we're looking at this issue of race and racism, certainly in the South African context, it is very much the Rhodes Must Fall movement, or the decolonial or sort of flawless movement, young people. And I suspect that's probably a similar experience within the USA. So yes, racism is to sort of summarize it, I suppose, is that every generation redefines this age-old problem from their own experiences. And I like to think also on building on what the legacies that are left behind by those who went before them.
Mm.
So in the same way in which the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very young people as well, builds on earlier civil rights movements, you know, on the sitting movements, on the Black Panther movement, and I think that if we are ever going to move beyond the scourge of racism, which manifests itself in many ways, structurally, systemically, economically, culturally, is that instead of us discarding our histories, is that we need to incorporate and build on those histories. Because one of the things and that's why I made the sort of qualification when I started that I don't want to sound ageist, be an ageist, but there is a little bit of danger, I suppose, for young people to often think that they are reinventing the world,
Right.
that they are dealing with issues that those who went before them either didn't understand or really were not committed to. No, it's that we worked with the tools that we had, the consciousness that we had, the understanding, and that has laid the foundation, I think, for where we are now. And so I think we are in a period now, what I would want to describe, where there is a reckoning with racism. That I think that we will finally settle the scores, as it were, which needs. And so yes, our understanding matures, evolves, and what is really exciting about this particular phase that we're in is the intersectionality. the way in which different movements are coming together. But at its core, is the issue of human dignity,
Yeah.
which is what the struggle against racism has always been about.
All right. Thank you so much for that engagement, Dr. Russell Ali. So to sum up what you said, you essentially said that racism is a dynamic term. It's continuously evolving, and the center of how we define racism is our engagement with human dignity, how we interact with humans, what we think of them will ultimately help us in defining what racism is in the context of whatever time frame we're looking at it at. Which is really true. And I think, young people of today, young people such as myself, like to observe things in isolation because our only real tangible experience is what we have in front of us. We've got amazing social media, we've got phones, we've got an understanding of the way people write things, and sort of our only reach into the circumference of things is what we get from the media, which is something that we obviously need to touch on in just a little bit. But I wanted to direct a question to you, Mr. Carter, about the Black Lives Movement. What sort of truths about racism came out during the time of Black Lives Matter in America? What sort of truths came out that aren't completely visible to the rest of the world during that time?
Carl is fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of things are really interesting about what's happening now. And so when you talk about building on previous movements, I think that, because of the internet and because we can see that these are actually citizen journalists that are fueling everything, right? And so that's something that as a movement hasn't been there before, right? And so even when you look at the civil rights movement, the previous movements, a lot of that imagery, a lot of the narrative is framed by traditional media. And so I think now you have this situation where, young people are often, behind these devices, behind the phones, who are capturing these moments, broadcasting them to the world. And I think, that is why it's different now than in previous movements, is that, there isn't as much control over the narrative as it used to be. Now, mind you, once traditional media gets a hold of it, then we lose control again. So it starts with citizen journalism, and we play these things out on social media, but ultimately we're not owning our platforms, which is why Snake Nation is about ownership and about, control of your narrative and economic and creative freedom, because those two things go together. Our ability to control our narrative is now more important than ever. And even from a Black Lives Matter standpoint, Black Lives Matter is actually a coalition. And so to the note on movement building and echoing, the Black consciousness movement being influenced by the Black Panther Party and the Black militant movement in America. But then you also have Arab Spring, and so did Arab Spring influence Black Lives Matter? Totally, because we consume all of these movements as a global youth culture. Does Fees Must Fall, have a cousin in the Black Lives Matter movement before? Absolutely. Do the riots in '92 around Rodney King have an impact on what people are doing now? Absolutely, because now you can see people, and I've seen the videos online of people who were there in those riots, now talking to young people, 20-year gap or more, now talking to young people saying, look, I was here for this one, I was here for that one. We were all there in the streets. What about now? What's going to be different? And so I think, to me, that's the question, is like, how do we take this to another level, so that we get real systemic change and put racism in our crosshairs? Because I agree, I think that just as, when you look at, the Me Too movement and how it systematically changed how women were treated in a variety of different ways, we have to look at racism in that same way, with everybody. If you are not a part of the solution, then you're part of the problem. And that's everybody from corporations to politicians to the average person, who are and if you're not actively trying to move the movement forward and you're just complicit in your privilege, then ultimately you're also part of the problem. And so I think that dialogue has been important. And just sitting here in the States and having, splitting my time between here and the continent, I would say that Black people in America understanding that we are part of a global community that sees our struggle and that aligns with it and recognizes it, and also on some level can understand it, because racism is a global issue. And that's why we're seeing millions of people in the street of all shades, because they're saying, look, I'm tired of being disenfranchised. I'm tired of police brutality. I'm tired of economic white supremacy. I'm tired of all of these different factors and slices of racism that contribute to what is systemic racism. Even when you look at the Black wealth gap being another example of systemic racism. So I'm sitting in Georgia, which has some of the worst income inequality in America. And of course, South Africa has some of the worst inequality on the planet. And so, both of those situations are factors of racism. Slavery was about economics. Let's not forget that. And so this all started with, how can we utilize and extract value from Black bodies to better and further our own economic agenda? And everybody from colonialism to slavery, to you name it, has followed that path. And so that's where I think, as we talk about what we want out of this movement, we've got to be really focused on clear-cut outcomes. So and even understanding too, like direct action is a tool, just like politics is a tool, just like media and journalism is also another tool, all serving our goal of freedom for our people. So that's how I think it's a bit different, and it may not be as apparent if we're all kind of outside or even inside of America and the world consuming the message from traditional media. We have to have more ownership of our own narrative, I think, ultimately.
So just to understand what you're saying, you've said that the Black Lives Matter movement carries sort of universal themes, and it's a banner that runs across the stretch of the earth that everyone who's experienced the same kind of oppression can sort of go under. And the success of this movement is based on the different facets along which it's distributed. So our media, our journalism, the conversations that we're having, all can create the success of the outcomes of the movement. We read an opinion piece by Ms. Moky Mokura regarding the Black Lives Matter movement and South Africa's involvement in it. Ms. Mokura, thank you so much for that opinion piece. Thank you for the insights that went into that opinion piece. I'm sure that our other panelists have invested time into reading it. I wanted to understand your particular perspective on South Africa's involvement in it. And there was a part in the article when I read it where it said that, essentially South Africa tends to neglect its own social problems in support of, the country that has the most social capital at that time. Could you explain that a little bit more and help myself and the panelists understand that perspective better?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for taking time to read it. I think the one thing I need to be clear about, I wasn't referring to South Africa. It was talking generally about the continent. And I felt that at the time when I wrote that piece, I was looking at what was in my view, which was like a bunch of young people who didn't seem that interested in some of the social justice issues that were happening right here on the continent, were very vocal, were tweeting, were joining the hashtag, seem to be joining what is a global movement, but it's predominantly and primarily a US-based movement, Black Lives Matter. It's become global, and I think there's a lot of reasons for it becoming global because of the time, because of COVID, because of people's frustration, because of George Floyd. There were a lot of reasons that triggered this moment. But the thing was that I felt that let's not let that be our only focus, and that let's learn from Black Lives Matter, because I think it's a phenomenal movement, the way it has become a global phenomenon. And the fact that I think we can learn a lot from it as Africans, not necessarily as South Africans, as Africans, because shortly after that, there were a number of things that happened that seemed to sort of escalate the whole racism issue in South Africa as a result of Black Lives Matter. So the whole piece was about this is what it should do, in that it should force us to look at some of the issues we have here, including racism, but there are a lot more. I mean, South Africa, for example, I think South Africa's been great around gender-based violence, but that was not happening in Nigeria, which as a result actually of Black Lives Matter, there started being some marches on gender-based violence. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. And that's exactly what I wanted to see happen. So it was not about South Africa, and it wasn't just about, we are ignoring what's going on here. I'm saying let's learn from what's happening in the Black Lives Matter movement and apply it to some of the injustices we're seeing here.
So, Dr. Russell Ali, thank you so much for that, Ms. Mokura. It's a better explanation. I completely completely understand what you're saying. Young people are always ready to follow the guy who has the best social capital. Whoever has the most followers, I'm gonna retweet what you're saying because I like it, because you're important. But I tend to neglect my own problems just so that I can associate myself with someone that's doing way more than me. But I also have the responsibility myself, and I understand your inspiration in that particular article, and I really do appreciate it. Dr. Russell Ali, I wanted to find out from you, upon reading Ms. Mokura's article, what kind of structures do you think are missing in South Africa that stop our young people from being mobilized or free enough to openly protest these issues and to actively do something to change them? What disables young South Africans from doing the same Black Lives Matter movement right here?
This is this is not an easy discussion, and why I say it's not an easy discussion is because I'm always very careful about how I speak about or even to young people, because I remember my own youth and the way in which we rebelled against our elders, who we thought were not radical enough. And so every generation, as I said, really defines its own struggle for themselves. And that's how it should be, actually, because every generation is responsible for itself. That's what agency is. But with the benefit, as I said, of sort of experience, one of the things that and here I kind of am wading into perhaps treacherous waters, because you asked me, so you pays your money and you takes your chances, right?
Absolutely.
So you asked me. One of the things I think that that I find I wouldn't say disconcerting, but something that needs to be looked at in terms of the politics of young people today is the predominance of identity politics. Okay. In other words, it's that political mobilization often is around affinity. Either LGBTI issues, LGBTQI issues, and often even within the LGBTQI movement, there's also identity issues, or around gender, or around issues of race. Now, I don't want to say that there is a hierarchy when it comes to issues of struggle. Because some people will have a kind of hierarchy, and they'll say, well, it should start with class, and then from class it should go to race, and from race it should go to gender, and then from gender it should go to sexuality, and that often that actually causes more divisions and fracturing, because, as I said, one of the exciting things about this new movement is its intersectionality. But intersectionality can also become a weakness, can become a vulnerability, if intersectionality is also not brought together with broad-based alliances that build unity, that is based more on what's common and what's shared, as opposed to what differentiates or separates. And so that's one of the things that I think that young people in South Africa, I don't know, I can't speak for the USA experience directly, just from what I read, but I do get a sense that there is a real tension between what I want to call mass mobilization around issues and identity mobilization or identity issues. And if we can find a healthy tension as opposed to an unhealthy fracturing, I think that the movement will benefit enormously. But if this tendency for identity politics to become more and more predominant, and to some extent almost overshadow the mass mobilization, then the kind of power structures that we are really trying to transform or change, they the main beneficiaries.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Dr. Russell. Some interesting thing that happened in South Africa during the time of Black Lives Matter was that on social media, I'm going to go into race. There were, colored boys and girls, colored young women and young men who said hashtag colored lives matter. And sort of, there was this uncomfortable experience in South Africa when we were all, uniting in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, where there was a side in South Africa that decided to differentiate itself from Black people. What is your opinion on that?
Look, I think that we as South Africans should now be mature enough to understand that racism in South Africa, while it had certain common denominators, it also differentiated. And the reality is that Black South Africans under the apartheid system were far worse off, generally. That is not to say that coloreds or Indians were free and were not discriminated against. But there was differentiation, and it served the interests of those who were in power. The old divide and conquer approach, which was really the basis of colonialism and colonial conquest, and in fact was the experience as well of slavery, as people will tell you, that the so-called house slave and the garden slave and so amongst the oppressed, often there is a playing off of one group against another. And so I have sympathy often with this notion of people feeling that my oppression is not being taken seriously, and particularly people who want to identify as colored. You've heard the saying often that we were not white enough in the old South Africa, and now we're not Black enough in the new South Africa. And so one can understand that sense of frustration or alienation. But we have to recognize that under oppression, we were not oppressed the same, okay? We were oppressed differently. But what we need to make sure is that in a new democratic country and an anti-racist country, we should create opportunities for everybody. In other words, we should not replicate the divisions that kept us subjugated in the new society that we're trying to move forward to create.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. And one of the things that's important when you sort of come into the aspect of redefining racism is, being able to sit on the ground and understand the young people as they are. And one of the panelists, Mr. Carter, or Karl Carter, what he does is, he's involved in disruptive media and he's involved in a lot of societies that engage with young people. A question I have to you, Karl, is that you've spent time sort of with the youth of South Africa, particularly in Cape Town and also in America. What are some of the mental or psychological differences that Black people in South Africa have compared to those in America? What I'm basically trying to ask you is, how do they each feel about each other? Because sometimes the way we feel about each other and the way we feel about the racial group that we associate with ultimately determines how we're going to act about the situations that oppress us. So what are sort of like the differences between those two groups, and what do you think is missing in each of them?
So I think I want to touch on something that Russell said really quickly. And so I think one of the key differences is this delineation between Black and colored that is not a thing here, right? And so that was one of my first things to adjust to, because it is a tool. I mean, this is textbook Willie Lynch, how you divide Black people, how you keep people oppressed, which is man against woman, light against dark, old against young. And this is like a slave owner's manual. And so to see it applied so systemically, and from a cultural standpoint, I think is massive. I mean, you know, when you talk about why the South African struggle resonates, I think, so deeply and probably most effectively with Black America, is because it felt very real. It was the most aware of. You know, Nelson Mandela was probably one of the most well-known African leaders that most Black people in America know about. And then, of course, we saw that the South African struggle very akin to the civil rights struggle. And so we recognize that flavor of oppression. And so I think that what I see in the young people are probably more commonalities than differences. You know, aside from, you know, from saying, well, I'm not Black, I'm colored, or you're not Black because you're lighter than me, which I just find ridiculous. Because where I'm from, light skin, dark skin, whatever, if you get pulled over, you're nervous as hell. So, you know, if like my color doesn't save me from, you know, going to jail or being oppressed or whatever that may be, then it doesn't matter, light or dark, we all kind of catch the same boot or knee to the neck, if you will. And so I think that to me is a construct that was unique to SA and is not a situation here. That being said, I think that, you know, to me, young people on the continent, and I'm gonna take a page out of Moky's book and not just focusing on SA, but talking about the continent, because we travel Africa broadly. And so I would say that in my opinion, I find the young people there a lot more globally politically aware than young people in America. And I think once you leave America, you start to understand your impact and the sort of the long arm of our culture. And so I would say that oftentimes America is so insulated and we're so focused because it's a big country and we just lots of times only think about ourselves. It's the only thing that's coming in. You know, it's like this echo chamber of, you know, yourself and what's happening here, that you don't really understand that we are actually a part of a multi-billion person tribe. So even how we think about ourselves diminishes our actual value, right? Because you're thinking about yourself in the context of how oppressors have framed the discussion. And so I think that, you know, young people on the continent, while even maybe separated by other things, understand that they are at home, number one, but they are part of a billion other people who look like them, you know, have, you know, similar, what's the difference in foods and music and so forth. Maybe some of the things that you hear kind of come up. Who has the best jollof rice, for example, you know, things like that, right? Which are fun prods, but at the end of the day, Africans know that they're African. And I think oftentimes Black Americans don't associate with Africa in the way that we should. And a lot of that is a function of racism, and is absolutely a function of the media, because you don't get the real story. And so I don't think that young people here have the same attachment. And you see it now in culture happening, where you see like major artists who are reaching over and you're seeing it in music, whether or not that's Drake and Wizkid, or you see Davido, you see Burna Boy, you see Casper, you see Nasty C, you see all these guys coming together and doing music together. And that's kind of that, you know, music is often at the forefront of social change. Like you can't extract culture from social movement. Culture's purpose is to fuel social movement. Like that's why you have song and art and dance and all those things that kind of come together. And so, you know, I think that young people, in my opinion, you know, here could stand to be more globally aware. That being said, well, you know, I agree with Russell as well, in that, you know, it's not our place. I'm in my 40s. It's not my place to say, well, young people should be moving in XYZ ways as it relates to their political movement, because I think we all have our own unique, you know, take on things that are a reflection of our upbringing, that reflection of our immediate reality. And so when I grew up, I was in the height of the crack era, and you know, I grew up in Washington, D.C. when it was the murder capital of America in 10 square miles. So my understanding of racism and police brutality was all about the war on drugs, you know, and that's with the largely black police force, right? And so we saw mass incarceration. We saw those things that happened then and continue now as probably the biggest things that stuck out to us as like massive injustice. I think you had Rodney King, and then you had other things in the 90s, and then the Million Man March and so forth. So there has been this constant drumbeat every so often of movements that are fueled by young people that are being impacted by the issue of the day. And right now, the issue of the day is systemic racism. So that roll up, that understanding of saying, well, you know, this happened here, and then this happened here, and then this happened here. You know, all of those to me are what young people now, you know, are uniquely dealing with that I didn't have to deal with, because it's just a culmination of things. You know, people are just tired of it, you know. So I actually am super excited to see not just people in the streets here, but people in the streets all over the world. And, you know, I referred to Arab Spring, and I wrote a little something about this, and just saying, like, look, like, we have to understand, like, we should be looking at how movements actually organically move. Like, what are the mechanics of a movement? And if the mechanics of a movement are people in the street and cameras and networks and messages and organization, then we need to make sure that we're following up with a strong agenda. And I would say that, to me, when I first moved to SA, I was really influenced and impressed with Fees Must Fall and Zuma Must Fall, the fallisms, right? I think Trump must fall, frankly, you know. So you know, I think we all can take and borrow and be influenced from each other, without, you know, any sort of, you know, pride of ownership, you know, because at the end of the day, that division only fuels, you know, the top 1%'s grip on everybody's lives. You know, and that's the thing that, you know, when you look at all the gains, I remember seeing a statistic last year was saying something like, you know, 20% of the gains were spread amongst everybody else, but 80% of the gains went to the top 1%. That's like management negotiating with labor, right? So you're saying you're getting 80% of the gains, and then 20% goes to those that are doing the work. Then that's clear management and labor split. And so I think that, you know, how we view these social movements can't only be about police brutality. It must be about every single aspect of racism, whether or not that's economic racism, whether or not that's my access to capital, whether or not that's you know, colorism, whether or not that's like understanding that Black queer lives matter too. Like, all of those, that intersectionality we talk about is what is what, to me, I think is probably most powerful of this particular movement. And I do pray that and want to work towards more people here understanding our global impact, and also what we should be taking from abroad, which is an understanding that we are, at the end of the day, Africans. And so, like, you know, I've never been so aware of being an American until I moved to Africa, you know. And so, like, you know, to me, if somebody calls you an American, we're quick to be like, I'm Black. Because here, you know, when you just call somebody an American, we don't just run around calling ourselves Americans in America, because Americans is white people on apple pie. That's not the Black experience. So that's why African Americans is important. Somebody saying, look, I'm Black, is a distinction that if you're not here, you don't really understand. So when you get there, it's just like, oh, you're an American. And it's like, and that's a rough one to take. So I do, you know, hope that we have more unity and more sort of global embracing of our collective power. Because I think that outside impact, like even the ability to say the UN should be looking at police brutality in America, and why is that not happening, right? Why is what's happening here not a global case? Why are our leaders not being put up in front of the ICC? These are things that we're not discussing that we should be, because it's America. And so America should not be above, you know, the scrutiny of the global community any more than, you know, any other country on this planet should be allowed to have human rights abuses. And that's what we're dealing with, is a human rights abuse based upon our race. And so, you know, I absolutely salute the young people in both here in the States and on the continent, because it's, you know, you have to be in the UK and throughout the diaspora, because, you know, this thing is, you know, just touching everybody. I have a friend in Amsterdam who was out at the Black Lives Matter movement, and what we don't even, and she really brought it home when she was like, this, you know, the Dutch perfected slavery. Like, we forget that. You know, so you go to Amsterdam, we have a great time, but like at the end of the day, the experiences of people in Amsterdam of color are also about that. So anyway.
Absolutely. I think, all right. Thank you so much for that. It's an amazing analysis that you've given. And what I've taken from it is that the thing that dismantles our collective power as people of color is the fact that we disassociate from each other, and we like to make these different distinctions about, you know, I'm African American, you know, this is who I am. I don't necessarily associate with Africans completely. And the phenomenon that's sort of come from that is, you know, the surge of xenophobia. And I wanted to direct this question to Dr. Russell Ali and Ms. Moky Mokura. what is your opinion of xenophobia in South Africa? Is it okay for us to be participating in these global movements amidst us being xenophobic and having these different xenophobic attacks? And how do you think we can move away from that at this particular time? I think we can start with you, Ms. Moky Mokura.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny, around the Black Lives Matter movement, shortly afterwards, there was a hashtag that trended on social media in South Africa, Nigerians must go, or Nigerians must fall. And that came out as a result of 2, I think, drug dealers who'd been caught and sentenced. And somebody posted that, for you guys who've all been supporting Black Lives Matter, I'm amazed that these same people are now strongly supporting this Nigerians must go hashtag.
Right.
And it completely struck me that it was, it was almost funny in that in one way, South Africans say, hey, we're with this movement, but right on our doorstep, there's this thing happening where it's hatred of other Africans, right? And it's really because of the narrative, the stories South Africans believe about other Africans that this stuff happens. So, one of the things that, Karl, you said was, youth in America versus youth in Africa. We in Africa know more about the youth in America than we know about each other. You in Kenya, I'm sure you know more about American culture than you do about, let's say, Gambian culture, because there's certain nationalities like Nigerians, that, our music is listened to. I feel that knowledge and closeness of us as Africans, we don't have it. And I absolutely think it needs to happen. And I think it starts with the fact that we need to have an interest in each other. Because right now, we are watching and consuming a lot of content that does not necessarily come from here. So yes, we talk about Hollywood. Yes, we talk about, I think the film industry in South Africa is amazing, but we watch a lot of US content. And one of the things, I run this organization called Filter. And one of the things that we commissioned was a piece of research, which is done by a university in Southern California, that was looking at how America viewed Africa. And what was quite interesting, that all of the mentions on entertainment media, there was literally nothing. But when we were mentioned as Africa, so it wasn't a specific country, and it was always negative. The storylines were always negative. They were just not positive. And then most of the news came from actually news, and it was typically coverage of elections and violence and all of this bad stuff that happens in Africa. Because the thing is, Africans don't look at us. Americans don't look at us. We look at them. And that was the point of that research, that Americans didn't really care. I think people started thinking, where's Africa, when Trump said shithole countries? I think that was the moment that a lot of Americans are, there's a place that has shithole countries. So I think basically what I'm saying is that we need to look to ourselves. That's the point I'm making. Yeah. And we need to understand each other better. And we actually have to start having an interest in each other. And I think my time here in South Africa, I'm a Nigerian. I've been in South Africa probably over 20 years. I am still that Nigerian woman. If I'd lived in America for 20 years, you wouldn't even know where I was from. I'd be an African American by now. Right. So I think for me, it's very clear that there are issues. And I think, Russell, to the point you made about we shouldn't let the past, the way, the constructs of the past, the coloreds and, the blacks and the Indians, how we were separated, it shouldn't be happening today. Likewise, I'll say that the way South Africans Black South Africans were treated in the past under apartheid, that's what they're playing out on non-Africans who are here.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there.
I would agree with that.
Absolutely, Moga. I can't sort of agree with you more. Remember that we're living through a very extraordinary time and through a global pandemic, COVID-19, which both exposes the benefits of globalization, but also the vulnerabilities. But I just want to use COVID as a bit of a sort of metaphor. If you one of the things that COVID has exposed is the fault lines globally, but it also exposes the fault lines within our own country, right? Who are people most vulnerable? Who are the people who are most seriously impacted? Where are the highest rates of death, of hospitalization? If you look at happening in the USA. It's people of color, it's African Americans, the Hispanics. If you come to South Africa, you come to Cape Town, we see what's happening in some of our townships in Khayelitsha. Now, why has COVID been so destructive amongst those communities? Because what COVID finds out is the comorbidities. That is what preys on. Okay, what we call the so-called underlying conditions. And that is what makes those who actually experience the worst of COVID are those who have the underlying or preconditions, right, or the comorbidities. Now, to come back to Moky's issue around xenophobia. You think about xenophobia, it's actually we need to be more accurate, because it's not xenophobia in the general sense, because this is not directed toward people from Europe or from America. Okay? It's directed against people from other parts of the African continent, mainly. Okay? So the kind of struggle that we are waging to transform our societies and our continent, where the dignity of Black people is being restored, what makes it difficult is the underlying almost sort of preconditions. So racism finds the kind of preconditions are almost comorbidities, our colonial divisions, our ethnic divides, color, Indian, and so it exacerbates. And so those who are most vulnerable are the ones who then are impacted almost disproportionately. And so we need really to understand that in some ways we can actually find lessons on the way in which we're dealing with this pandemic, because it's global. We can find some lessons as to how we can deal with racism, which itself is a global issue, although the way it manifests itself is different because of unique context and circumstances.
So I think what you're saying is interesting, and I really appreciate the engagement that Moky and Russell have provided regarding the idea or the reality, of xenophobia. What most people, and what myself and other young people argue is that, the justification for xenophobia against other Africans exists under the banner of economic circumstance. So, the original narrative that people pass among other young people is that, the foreigners come to the country and they take our jobs and they leave us, completely disempowered. We're not allowed to have these shops because they're there. We can't do the shop because they are likely to do it better. I'm not getting equal access to employment opportunities because someone who is struggling more and is willing to fight more for these opportunities that I have access to is doing it better than me, and I don't want that kind of competition in my own country. So what the question is do you think xenophobia against other Africans is justified on an economic standpoint, considering the circumstances that Black South Africans have today? And anyway, this is an open question to any of the panelists.
I want to just jump in on this one if I can, but no way. Because at the end of the day, like, let's look at the list of the richest people in South Africa. So if you really are revolutionaries and you really want to bang on the system and all this kind of stuff, if 7 or 8 of the 10 richest people in South Africa are white South Africans, then your issue is not with other people of color that come there to make a living. Your issue is with the people that continue to hoard resources at the top. That's the real issue, right? And so, and the same thing happens here, right? It's the same narrative where people say, well, it's for us, it's like, oh, it's the Mexicans. The Mexicans want your jobs, and so it's whoever, right? It's whoever it is that gets you looking at another person of color and not looking up. And that's the thing that we have to do. We have to look up. We have to be able to like level up and say, wait a minute, this system is wrong. And I can tell you, I've experienced this. Like, I know African Americans that have been in South Africa for 20 years and have horror stories about trying to do business with South Africans because they simply say, look, like, you're not my brother. And I start to say, brother, cousins, not brothers. That's how it kind of feels like, yeah, we're Black, but yeah. And so like, maybe, we're not getting attacked xenophobically, but I think it surfaces in other ways. And country pride is fine, right? But when it starts to level up to violence, we're not doing anything but continuing to perpetuate a system that does not have our best interests at heart as Black people. And that system is global in nature, right? So white influence and capital on the continent is the same as it is in Europe, it's the same as it is in the States. I mean, it all kind of levels up to the same system, which is like, how do we continue to keep white supremacy going, the machine of white supremacy going? And so I think xenophobia, in whatever the flavor it is absolutely wrong, you know, and because the question should be, why are we competing for shekels? Why are we competing for, you know, and who is our common oppressor and why are we oppressed? Like starting to ask those systemic questions again of ourselves. I think that's where we should be focusing our energy. And, you know, it's nice for us to pontificate on a panel about this thing, but I think when you're living in it, right? Like, so it's easy for us to kind of say, yes, this is wrong, but then also trying to also have some empathy for people that are like living in the struggle, living in those conditions. And so that's all that you see. And so that very living situation happens all over, you know. That happens here where people will look at an African when they come here and say, oh man, like this African's here to do whatever, but you know, but there aren't enough, you know, it hasn't been given that same, you know, to Moky's point, like you could be here and there's a massive, you know, tons of Africans in America, right? Both ones that came here 400 years ago, the ones that came more recently, right? But you know, like oftentimes that xenophobia is pointed at Latinos, is pointed at Mexicans specifically, because the idea is like, well, they're here to take low-paying jobs. So the question is like, why are we all kind of scrambling for low-paying jobs? You know, that
so
is
Carl, can I just interrupt, because it's a really good point. Sharon, who's behind the scenes, actually asked, I want to ask you that very same question that you asked us. Do you think xenophobia is justified on this economic argument?
Oh, is this question directed at me?
Yes, it's you.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, this is a loaded question, and I think, you know, there's so many levels of analysis when you come into looking at xenophobia. I think the rationality behind xenophobia is unjustified. I don't think it's okay for us to have the separation amongst people who are coming here to do the same thing. You know, we should look at South Africa as sort of a hub for opportunities that we don't have to fight for, because there's more than enough space and there's more than enough ideation that goes on within the young African's mind to allow him to get a job besides cleaning the office for the white guy. But you see, when it comes to the reactions that South Africans have towards other foreign African people in this country, I think, you know, we need to also start looking at certain realities. So, for example, there's this sort of idea that foreign nationals bring drug into the community, they bring prostitution into the community, they sort of have this identity attached to them that they keep on defiling South Africa and they need to go. Most of that, or some of that, is an actual, you know, it's a real thing that needs to be addressed, you know, and so the frustration that certain South Africans may have towards other foreign nationals is true and it's real, because some of the harms that they bring into the spaces are right. But I don't think, you know, on an economic front, that the behavior is justified. They shouldn't be, like Karl says, they shouldn't be scrambling for jobs. But there's other social issues, you know, when it comes to integration that South Africans are struggling with and foreign nationals are struggling with. I hope that answers the question. I have a lot more to say, but I think, you know, there are certain social realities that we need to be honest with, that we need to confront, and we need to address them correctly. And our government isn't playing the part.
Yeah, poverty and inequality will always be breeding grounds for issues like xenophobia. In fact, many social ills, gender-based violence. Where is gender-based violence most acute? Is amongst more vulnerable, poor communities. Okay. And where the impacts are a lot more devastating. So, of course, we understand xenophobia at an intellectual level as something to be rejected, something that's abhorrent, unacceptable. But until we start addressing the underlying structural conditions that provides the breeding ground, we're not really going to be able to root this out of our society. In the same way that we were speaking about racism and systemic racism, I think that xenophobia, xenophobia is an extension almost. It's a peculiar form of racism, and often it is racism amongst those themselves who are being victimized. You know, it's the victims themselves who are inflicting damage on themselves. It's like it's sort of, you know, a double, almost sort of victimization. But
the oppressor becomes the oppressed, and the other way around.
They're living under such dehumanizing socioeconomic conditions that they themselves become dehumanized to the plight of others, right? It doesn't help us then to just deal with them as perpetrators. You see, that's what I'm trying to make. So of course we have to be critical. Of course there's got to be order, because it's not acceptable. But we have to recognize that as much as they are perpetrators, they are also victims. And if we don't have that more nuanced understanding, then we're not going to be able to build those alliances, those bridges, where we really tackle the underlying fundamental structural condition that turns poor people against themselves.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Yes, Ms. Moky.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to sort of add on to that, because I think there's a lot of underlying issues, you know, with the racism and, you know, Black Lives Matter. I think part of what I was trying to say, that if we could eliminate a lot of these underlying issues in our society, we would all be better off. One of the big questions at the beginning was, should we redefine racism? I mean, racism today may not reflect some of the things that we are experiencing as Black people, as in the word itself. And I know there's a group of people that came up with another one called knee necker. I don't know if you guys heard about this, and it is on social media, knee necker. And it was, I'm just going to read what the definition was. It's called the brutal, relentless, centuries-long terrorization, stifling, asphyxiation, and oppression of Black people, Black culture, and Black lives. And it's called NENA. So they made that up. But the point I'm making, I think that, you know, when you think about poverty, when you think about, you know, the gender-based violence, when you think about ethnicity and all of these issues, actually it's often Black people that seem to bear the brunt a lot of all of these things. And I think the focus on racism, I feel, it's not necessarily where we should put all our energy, because if we fix these underlying issues, we will be better off as a race of people, not just, you know, okay, we've got, you know, we've won against the whites, but, you know, half of us are still living in poverty. The other half are being beaten senseless, you know, the other half are killing each other because, you know, I'm not an Igbo, I'm a Yoruba. We have a lot of issues that we need to prioritize and focus on as Africans, as Black. And maybe I think that's the point that my article was trying to make, that Black Lives Matter, yes, it's important, but our lives matter so much more. Let's fix them.
It's like music to my ears, you know, because you're going down that road of a sort of historical materialist kind of sort of analysis, which is what my generation was, that, you know, that was the sort of intellectual influences around at the time when we were coming of age politically. And again, I don't want to be telling young people what they should be reading and what they should be thinking, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in still going back to those historical materialist analysis of people like what was his name, Rodney, Walter Rodney, if you remember, on imperialism and those. Colin Levy and all those sort of writers. There's a lot of wisdom in that, and to sort of craft their strategies and their sort of been so tech savvy, you know, the social media around those sort of analysis. Because one of the things, I mean, Karl spoke about the Arab Spring. One of the lessons that we learned from the Arab Spring is that if you don't turn that spring into a summer, you only do that by organization, by building political movements, go into a worse winter.
Yeah.
And this is really what those early writers. That's really contributions that is about building structures, building political movements that are sustainable. And that's really how societies move forward. So social media and Twitter and trending is wonderful, but it's not sustainable if there is no structure, an organization that holds it together moving forward.
Yeah, and just real quick point, because I know we're about to wrap up, but I would encourage everyone to check out New York Times ran an article on the movement for Black Lives political agenda, right? So they have released, a series of very strong political positions, whether or not that's defunding the police and moving those resources into communities, or and a variety of topics, even down to like how does environmental racism impact our lives. And so I would absolutely agree with that. I love the way you turn that phrase. I'm gonna have to use that one and credit you for it, Russell. But absolutely, because it is about that summer afterwards, and not just the spring. And so I am heartened by what I'm seeing, is that people are thinking in that way, and I absolutely support and applaud that. So absolutely, great point.
So I understand that we have to wrap up the session. I have one last question. So we're on a digital platform, and multiple young people are streaming to view the opinions of these great, people who have an understanding of things. And the way, according to my perspective, the way you empower, an African child is to allow him to reflect on his political, economic, and social experience. Karl and Moky have companies that, directly empower young Africans in that particular way. So what sort of things do you encourage, the young people involved in your specific companies to do in order to empower their idea of an African and give them that sense of identity, that unified sense of identity that's currently missing today? Moky, you can take this one, and then Karl, please.
Wow, big question. Look, I feel young people need to use their voice. I think African culture is one where it's ageist. The older you are, the more you have an opinion. The younger you are, you shouldn't speak. I feel that this is a time for young people to use their voice and not wait to be invited. Because I feel, we get that a lot. Oh, but there's no young people represented. Young people, go and do your own. Do your own. Create your own moments where people listen to you. So just use your voice. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Now, I feel like Moky is because we have very similar viewpoints. When I was reading up on all the incredible work that she's doing and her organization is doing, so I absolutely believe like owning the narrative, being involved in the creative economy, not being satisfied with simply producing or creating on white-owned platforms. Like, how do we actually start to have our own platforms that we own, and more control of our narrative? That's a lot of what Snake Nation is about, and understanding and looking at the creative economy as a source that we rightfully should be pulling prosperity from. And so, I would definitely encourage that, because in times like this, our ability to earn a living while we say what we want to say is sort of the ethos and the bedrock of why Snake Nation exists. We absolutely 1,000% believe that a Pan-African way forward is the way forward. A global viewpoint as Black people is the way forward. And so I would just encourage everybody to kind of leave the borders alone and just start to see ourselves as one people scattered all over the earth and move accordingly. And so that would be my take on where I think young people should be not picking up on some of the lessons.
I see he's
okay. And we'd like to see many more of them come to the University of Cape Town. As well. We'd love to have them there as well, because they're the ones who the knowledge producers.
Right, absolutely.
Wow. All of them are knowledge producers, Black without borders. That is today's session on redefining racism. I think the central message that we've gathered from our panelists is the fact that once we remove all of the socioeconomic problems that we all face as humans, we'll sort of eradicate, the residue of racism in between these problems that we're having. It's been Karl Carter, Russell Ali, and Moky Mokura who's been talking to us today. It's been stunning. I think we've all gathered a lot of understanding and knowledge on what we can do and how we can change our narrative and take control of our narrative as young Black people today. Campus Digital Party, it's been great. Thank you so much again. I'm not sure if we have no questions, but it's been lovely.
And thank you and
Thank you. Well done, great job.
Nice meeting all of you.
Thank you so much.
One of the advantages of this new virtual world is you're actually meeting so many more people who you wouldn't have met otherwise. So
absolutely. It's been a pleasure meeting you all. It really has. You guys are so amazing and so insightful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Bye.
Peace.